One of the interesting aspects of the 2024 election is something recent, which is the podcast race. Trump has been doing long form podcast interviews for about a month. And Harris this week just jumped on board on this. Well, she did it a couple weeks ago. She jumped on board. So I came across this post on X, and it said Kamala Harris did 4 interviews with outlets and massive audiences the last few days and cooked. Meanwhile, Trump lied, got fact-checked in real time by Laura Ingraham, and laughed at by Andrew Schulz. Now, this guy's half right. I'm not sure about the Laura Ingraham thing. I think she did fact check him on something. I'm not sure what the fact check was about. And Andrew Schulz did laugh at him because Trump did a long form podcast interview with Andrew Schulz on his Flagrant podcast. And Trump said, I'm a very truthful person. And Schulz laughed because it is a laughable thing that Trump is very truthful. It is laughable. However, this guy is wrong when he said she cooked in these interviews, and I'll explain why. So I mentioned how Trump has been doing these interviews for the past month. So like a month ago, I was on YouTube, and I saw, I'm subscribed to Theo Vaughn's podcast. I don't watch it too often, but I was scrolling through, and then there was Theo Vaughn interviewing Trump. I was like, Trump? Where did this come from? And Trump did a long form, like an hour or so interview with Theo Vaughn. And Theo Vaughn is a stand-up comedian. But he's even a more successful podcaster. And since that interview was recorded like a month ago, they got like 13 million views on that. Another interview I saw Trump do, he was with this guy named Lex Fridman. Lex Fridman is a very successful podcast interviewer on YouTube. And he interviews a whole bunch of different types of people. And he also was like about a month ago. And he got 5 million views on that one. And now Andrew Schulz, even though Andrew did laugh at Trump, it was a very civil conversation. Because Trump in these interviews, he's very relaxed, very lucid. He's not the bombastic guy at these rallies. He's just very relaxed. Like he feels very comfortable on these podcast interviews. It reminds me when he used to be on Stern, Howard Stern a long time ago in some ways. The Schulz podcast, the Flagrant podcast, got in like a day or so, 2 million views, right? So let's look at Kamala Harris. So Kamala Harris, she didn't do interviews for the longest time. I felt like she should have been doing interviews since the DNC, but she didn't. But she went on a full media blitz these past few days. She was on Colbert, The View. She was on. She had an interview with Howard Stern on SiriusXM, and she did before that. She did the All the Smoke podcast with Matt Barnes and Stephen Jackson, and the Call Me Daddy podcast. So if we break these things down, All the Smoke was the first one she did. That only got about 500,000 views. I think she was trying to reach black male voters. I don't know if that was the right platform to do it in, because those guys host a basketball podcast, and I don't think they was going to do any pushback on questions. I think they just want to be on her good side just in case. So just in case she wants to come back, which I understand. But if you're talking about, trying to connect with black male voters, I'm not sure that's the right podcast to go in, but that's the one she chose. So she got about 500,000 views on that. Call Me Daddy, that's been the much thing that's been talked about the most, that she appeared on that podcast. Again, over 500,000 viewers on that. Stern was the most. And with that one, she got about 600,000 views on that. So if we're comparing the two, Trump really cooked on his podcast because he got like 13 million, 5 million, and 2 million. And Kamala's gotten 500,000, 500,000, 600,000. Now, it's going to be interesting when the election actually happens and whoever wins. How did the podcast affect the race and not affect the race? If Kamala Harris wins, and the podcast by that point probably be around 1 million. It'll probably be a little bit over 1 million because, we're still a few weeks away. So let's say it's close to 1 million, over 1 million from these podcast views that she's done. They might say, well, the people that she talked to for the most part were either not going to vote for her anyway, like in Stern's case. Like most of the people who are really into Stern, for the most part, they probably go vote for Trump anyway and probably aren't going to vote for Harris. She might pull a few people, but not that much. Or they were going to vote for her in the first place. Like the Call Me Daddy audience were probably going to vote for Kamala anyway. And the All the Smoke podcast, you know, for the most part, some of those black men was kind of probably go vote for her anyway, or maybe not vote at all. So I don't think Kamala Harris is reaching too many different people that's going to vote for her. And the thing about her interviews, podcast interviews, is there's not a lot of buzz coming off of them. She's not saying anything new. Like, I wish, the thing about these interviews is she's very much like Trump. She's very relaxed. Like, if you watch her on The Smoke, even Call Me Daddy, she's very relaxed on these things. Like, I think she really enjoyed her time on these podcasts, but she's not saying anything new. And that's what she should be doing. She should be bringing up some policy ideas or things that she hasn't said before, but she's not doing that. Now, if Trump wins, so basically, if she wins the election, they might say, well, the numbers that she has on the podcast didn't translate to the votes that she got becoming president. So in her case, the podcast might not matter to her because she's already speaking to the choir, right? Trump's case is a little bit different. Theo Vaughn, he interviews everybody from Drewski to Shane Gillis. So he has a cross section of people that he interviews. They might lean slightly conservative. I'm not sure. But for the most part, Trump might pull a moderate. Because Theo Vaughn has a cross section of people, you get Democrats and Republicans. So he might have Democrats listening to him. It's like, oh, okay, well, I might not vote for him still. But, it's interesting hearing Trump talk like this in this format. And he might pull a voter or two, right? Same thing with Lex Fridman. Same thing. Cross section of people. He might pull a moderate. You might call him a Republican moderate. He might have been on the fence. They might listen to him and say, oh, okay, this is interesting. He sounds different than how he usually sounds. So there's that. And then when you get to Andrew Schulz, I don't know if Andrew Schulz, how politically involved Andrew Schulz's audience is. They're usually there for jokes and laughs. So he might be able to pull some non-voters in that one. So Trump is actually hitting different markets than Kamala Harris when it comes to podcasts. The interesting thing so if Trump wins, they might say his work on these podcasts going on these different platforms might have actually helped him in the election with his votes. So the 13 million we saw and the 5 million and the 2 million that we've seen from these podcast interviews did translate to his win if he does win. The interesting thing is, I was looking at Stephen A. Smith and he was talking about Kamala Harris on these podcasts. Like, I'm sure Stephen would love to get Kamala or Trump on his podcast. I don't think that's going to happen. It'll be interesting if Kamala, because I'm sure Shannon Sharp would love to get her on Club Shay Shay, Kamala or Trump. I'm sure they would love to go for them to come on Club Shay Shay. He might be able to get Trump, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think he would love to have Kamala, but I don't think Kamala would go on this show just because I think Shannon would probably ask her a few tough questions. The thing about when she was on The View that I didn't like is that they all kind of sat there like this. Tell me more. They just didn't push back on anything. That's why I kind of enjoyed the 60 Minutes interview that was with Bill Whitaker. Like, Bill Whitaker was going to interview her and Trump, I believe, and Trump bailed out, just like he bailed out with the interview with Leslie Stahl back in 2020, because he knew Leslie Stahl was going to ask him tough questions, and he probably knew that Bill Whitaker is a true journalist, and he was going to ask Trump some tough questions, so he bailed out. Kamala took the interview, which is fine, but I don't think she was prepared. That Bill Whitaker was like pushing her back on things, not in a mean way. He's just like, hey, how you going to pay for this stuff? Simple stuff. And she answered the question, but 60 Minutes is real journalism. The one of these things that's going to happen in the near future after this election is that I think more presidential people running for president, I think they're going to appear on more podcasts because most podcasters are not going to push back, and most of them are not really fully politically astute. Going on 60 Minutes, they're going to ask tough questions. Dateline, all these things, they're going to ask tough questions. So I think moving forward, traditional media might actually lose out more interviews to podcasters because podcasters are not going to ask these tough questions. But I like Kamala on 60 Minutes because they ask the tough questions because she needs that. Because I think they'd be babying Kamala too much and she needed that push. So what do you think about all these podcast interviews these politicians are doing, Trump and Harris? What do you think of them? Did you like Kamala on these podcasts? Did you like Trump on these podcasts? Joe Rogan should be the one that should get them, but Joe is kind of tough. And I don't know, that might be October surprise. Trump on Joe Rogan. That'd be interesting. Maybe not so much Kamala. He might be tough on her.